So we're continuing to talk about soils, and we've seen soil texture in the lab. You've felt the differences between sand and clay. So we just want to put that on the notes here, so you have some text to go along with that and some explanation of that. So we said that texture was related to what size of the particles we have in the soil. So if we start with parent material, if we start with rocks and we break down those rocks into our mineral material, then our next question is, in the soils, how big are the particles that come from those rocks? Sometimes with things like sandstone, you'll get sandy textured soils. Sometimes with things like slate or shale, you'll get much finer textured soils. And the texture, the word texture just tells us about the particle size. Like, are we dealing with larger soil particles or smaller soil particles? So we've got sands, silts, and clays. These make up the main three kinds of particles that we really care about in the soil. When we have, like we worked with the textural triangle in the lab, when you have a percentage of each one of those, when you have 30% sand and 40% silt and 30% clay, you have a total soil, right? You've got 100% of the soil particles. So that percentage then lets us put them into different categories, say a loamy sand or a clay loam, and that gives us words to talk about textures wherever we see them. So you'll notice that in the ecological site inventory for Heart Mountain Ranch, a lot of those ecological sites are characterized by the soil type, by the soil name. So a sandy loam upland, or a clay riparian zone, or things like that. So it shows that soils are really important to what goes on in rangeland. So sand particles, are larger particles. They're the largest of the particles that we have in soil. After that comes silt, which are smaller than sand but bigger than clay. Silt is often associated with, like this picture we have here, of alluvial, so water deposited materials often are referred to as silty materials. They don't always have to be silty. Sometimes we can have clay deposited by water and sand deposited by water, but silt is fairly common. And then we have the clay particles. Now this is a scanning electron microscope image of a clay particle. And the reason we have to do electron microscopy, use electron microscopes, is because you can't see these with your regular eyes. You have to have magnification, in this instance really high amounts of magnification, to see what a clay looks like. So they're the smallest of our soil particles, but they're actually the most important of our soil particles, regardless of what we're dealing with. Because they're so small, and because they have this plate-like, so as you look at this picture, you can see the stacks. It looks like a bunch of stacked plates, and that's exactly what clay is. They're just layers. If you're familiar, if you looked at the mineral mica or muscovite, those kinds of minerals look like this as well. You can peel off little layers of them. But clays are microscopic particles of soil, so they are mineral material that are made up of stacks of clay, and those stacks allow us to actually hold quite a bit of water. And it turns out that the way the stacks are formed, they actually let us hold nutrients on the surface of these clays as well, which becomes really important for nutrient cycling, and for plants to be able to have nutrients available to them. So the content of clay in a soil, in any soil, particularly in rangeland soil, will have a lot to do with how much water is able to be held and how much nutrient might be available for plant use in that soil. So if we compare to each other, and this isn't exactly right, but it gives you kind of a scale of the particles sizes. So you can see our sands, and then our silt sizes, that orange ball, and then the clay size, which is and those are the largest kinds of clays by comparison. So you can see how we start to distinguish one soil from another based on what kind of particles we have in that soil. It'll make a big difference to water movement in the soil, to the ability of the soil to hold nutrients, to ability of plants to have access to water, and so forth. So like I said, texture, even though it's an interesting thing to kind of call out by itself and say, what kind of texture do we have, and what does texture mean? It means we have more sand or less sand, more clay or less clay. That really relates to plant production, because soil texture is, in a real sense, the ability to have nutrients. And these nutrients, like you see here, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, are nutrients that all plants everywhere need to grow. So the amount of clay content, again, really is an important thing to know. Sands don't have the ability to hold nutrients. Sands don't have a really large ability to hold water either. Silts have a little bit more ability to hold water, but again, no ability to hold nitrogen, hold nutrients. So why is that? The reason is because like we saw, clay is a microscopic particle, and it has lots of different layers. Those layers allow the soil to hold more water than what sand would be able to hold. So clays have a lot of surface area, just plain old area to stick water on, than sand does. So we have this little phrase here, a handful of clay. So if you had a handful of clay and a handful of sand, the handful of clay actually has a surface area that would blow your mind, right? So let's pretend like you're probably in a room right now. If you had a handful of sand, that handful of sand, the surface area might be equal to the floor, to the surface area of the floor. So you look down at the floor, okay, there's a surface area, right? Your handful of clay would be comparable to having a surface area of the floor, the ceiling, all the walls, and depending on what building you're in, probably the surface area of the hallways and every other room that's in that building. If you're in the Fagerberg building where I am right now, the surface area of the clay would equal the surface area of every surface, so floor, ceiling, all the walls, plus of one room, plus the hallway surface area, plus all the surface area of every single surface in several other rooms. So that's what we mean. There's just more place to put water, more place to put nutrients. So texture is important for what we call water holding capacity, so ability of the soil to hold water for plants or infiltrate water for the health of the water that's leaving that system. But we know that with something like sand can move water, can infiltrate water faster than clays can, and so that can become problematic. It turns out that organic matter in most soils helps both the infiltration and the water holding capacity, but sands obviously can move water much faster. Clays have very, very small open spaces in the soil. So again, think about that handful of sand and handful of clay. If you had that handful of sand, water would move rapidly through that because the open spaces in sand are big. The open spaces in clays are fairly small, so it's difficult for water to move through those soils. Loam soils give us the best of both worlds. So loams are an equal, not necessarily an equal percentage, but an equal feel. If we're doing texture by feel method, an equal feel of sand, silt, and clay, and that allows us to have a good amount of holding capacity for water and a good amount of water that moves through the soil. So here's a comparison. So when we're thinking about the size of the open spaces in soil, we call them pore spaces. So the size of pore spaces that you can see on the left-hand side are much larger and much more capable of moving water through them than the pore spaces, the open spaces on the right-hand side. The water has to go through a longer road to get through that soil than on the left-hand side. We've seen this textural triangle before in lab, so I won't cover it here, other than just to say this is the official graph that tells us where we are in terms of soil texture if we know the textural percentages, which you can send off to a lab or you can estimate using the texture by feel method. In lab, we also covered soil structure, and we said that soil structure was how soil sticks together, which sounds really boring, but actually it turns out that how soil sticks together, how soil clumps together, really matters to water movement in the soil. The better clumping they have, the more healthy clumping that we have in the soil, structure that we have in the soil, the better water moves into that soil and through the soil. So if it's poor, again, we don't have good water movement through the soil. So we have lots of types of soil structure. Single grain we saw in the lab. Blocky we also saw in the lab. Platy we saw. Granular, we saw that one with cookie crumb type structure. And then prismatic we didn't see. Prismatic is a longer, kind of a longer, skinnier type of soil structure. And then massive we saw in the lab. And massive is just a big clump of soil that doesn't really fit into the other textural categories. Here's why structure matters. So with something like single grain or granular on the left-hand side, we have rapid water movement into the soil. So we can lock away some of that soil water. We're moving it in. We're not eroding soil off the top of the soil because it's not infiltrating the soil. If we don't have infiltration, movement of water into the soil, then water runs over land. And that overland running of water is really a bad thing for rangeland. It erodes that top layer of soil, and we want to keep as much soil on our range as we possibly can. Blocky and prismatic, that middle part there, you can see that there's a moderate rate of moving water. And then over on plate-like or platy and massive, it's very difficult to get water to move through those kinds of soil structures. So this again gives us kind of a background to understand the nature of rangeland from just a physical characteristic standpoint. Does this rangeland is it conducive to moving water, capturing water in that soil, or is it very difficult to capture water in that soil because we have, the structures that are on the right-hand side, the plate-like or the massive structures? So here's just some views of the different kinds of structure. So granular, think about a cookie crumb crumbling in your hand. That's what we look like. That's found in the upper horizons. Then we have blocky, and there's a couple of sub-kinds of blocky. We don't really need to concern ourselves with them here, other than to say they're block-like. They don't have to be perfectly cubed. They just have to be larger than granular, and we have some constraints on that. And then prismatic, you can see to the left of that Swiss Army knife, and a little bit to the bottom right there, longer, skinnier kinds of sharp-edged structures. And here's platy. You can see right in the middle of that picture, below that green plant, and to the right just a little bit. You see those, it kind of looks like stacked structure. It kind of looks like a blocky soil structure that's been smashed down. And often that is the case, that it's actually been compacted. And again, it doesn't let us move water very fast through that soil. In terms of soil structure, the stuff that holds that together is organic matter. So dead plant and animal remains, microbial exudates, which just means, when you think about an earthworm, when it's going through the soil, it's got slime that's coming out of it, and that slime is lubricating the earthworm to move through the soil, but it also actually becomes part of the organic matter that's in the soil. So that's the glue we have to hold soil together, glue that holds soil together. Platy structure, I guess we said that was because of compaction. Prismatic structure, we have a lot of that in arid areas, is conducive to forming kinds of prismatic structure. Massive typically is found lower down in the soil, and overgrazing can cause that to happen, and compaction. We said that in rangelands, depth is really one of the key players in terms of plant production. So that's just the distance from the surface to some kind of restrictive layer. That could be rock, that could be a caliche calcium layer, and in range that really causes difficulties with plant growth. Now, is a shallow soil always a bad thing? It turns out that it's actually not, because think about grasses. Grasses don't need to grow, don't need to have roots incredibly deep in the soil. They're okay with a couple of feet of soil to grow in. So it's not always a bad thing. Sometimes it can be, depending on how restrictive that layer is, but it's not always a bad thing. Finally, we're just going to run real fast through the soil pH. There's not much we can do to change soil pH. It's kind of like the cards you've been dealt. Typically, we have pH 3 to pH 9 or 10 in the soil. That's not the whole pH scale. The whole pH scale goes from 0 to 14. In the soil, we only have from 3 to 9 or so. Out here in the west, our pH is upwards of 8, and that's just again there's not much you can do to change that. You can't easily change that. So finally, two more little topics. First, organic matter. Organic matter, we said, is the biological material that's decayed in the soil and become part of the soil. So we usually say plant or animal parts. What we really mean is plant roots, plant leaves and stems that are left on the soil, and the bodies of microbes, the bodies of any insects living in the soil. That's usually what it boils down to. Animal remains other than manure aren't usually part of that equation. The organic matter in a soil is not a huge part of the soil, but it's a very, very important part of the soil. So you can see it's only 1 to 6% of the composition of the soil. And the thing that, since it's the magic stuff in the soil. So it can help us hold water in the soil. It can help the soil be able to absorb water and keep that water in the soil. It can also itself give out nutrients to the soil. It can also hold nutrients in the soil. So it turns out, and it affects soil structure. It glues the soil together. So it's got a lot of really important characteristics to it, and we can identify organic matter in range soils, and we can categorize it as higher or low organic matter in soil. So your notes just say exactly what I just said. In grasslands, grasslands that are in more humid climates, more temperate to humid climates, those tend to have higher amounts of organic matter deposited in them, and so they're darker. So grassland soils tend to be darker than with organic matter than, say, a forest soil deeper into the soil. Now, a forest soil probably will have a layer of organic matter sitting at the very top of the soil as its own layer, but it's not incorporated into the mineral soil, to the upper horizons of the soil. So grasslands tend to have more organic matter than incorporated into the soil than forests do. Fertility is the last little piece of soils. Now, we don't spend a lot of time talking about soil fertility, and by fertility, we're talking about nutrients, minerals that the plants need to grow in order to make a leaf, to make a seed, to restore leaf material after it's been grazed. That is soil fertility, the material, the minerals that are in the soil that are taken up by plants to rebuild plant tissue. Nitrogen is the big one. Nitrogen is the most limiting nutrient for any kind of plant, including range plants, on the surface of the earth in most cases. Rangeland is almost always deficient in those nutrients. There's a lot of really interesting stuff happening in terms of fertility on rangelands, and so we've discussed a little bit about nutrient cycling on rangelands and how with grasses, with more fibrous root systems, fibrous roots and really thick and large amounts of roots underneath grasslands is more conducive to when plant stems and leaves die and are deposited onto the top of that soil surface and get broken down by microorganisms. Grasslands are more capable of taking the nutrients that come off that broken down material, that organic matter, and recycling those back into the plant. They're much more efficient at fertility cycles, and you can see down here at the bottom I've got just a little piece of a fertility cycle, piece of a nitrogen cycle. So in grasslands we have much more closed system. So we have good nutrient, good fertility cycling. In places that get higher, in rangelands that get higher rainfall amounts, in rangelands that have forest type soils where the root material isn't as dense in that upper feet or two of soil, we have more nutrient loss in those systems. That's about all we want to say about fertility. We can't necessarily improve fertility by man-made methods on rangelands. We have to use things like targeted grazing and the manure deposition that comes off of grazing to really help out our fertility cycles on range. So that's it for soils. We're going to talk a little bit more about soils in terms of classifying different kinds of soil. So we have sort of a vocabulary of soil types. That'll be soil classification, and we'll get to that in a little bit.